I want to make a quick take video in light of some recent YouTube drama that's been dominating my subscription feed in the last week. Or to be quite honest, dominating my subscription feed for the last 2 weeks. This, of course, is the drama surrounding the conflict between Mr. Metokur and Sargon of Akkad. Now, when I originally saw this little spat break out on YouTube, my immediate response was, I want no part of this. This is simply internet drama. Nothing productive can come out of it. But as the days went on and turned into weeks, I realized that this just was not going away. So I'm hoping with this analysis, I can provide some amount of closure for this question so I don't keep on hearing the same pointless and counterproductive arguments erupting again and again and again. Now, for people who've been watching my YouTube channel for a while now, you will know that I have basically built most of my subscriber base on critiques of Sargon of Akkad. In my own personal interactions with the man, I have found him to be rather well-adjusted and a person of good humor, which I think is oftentimes in short supply. This being said, the point of this video is not to either run Sargon down or to praise him unduly, but to provide some kind of context so people can get back to work with things that it might actually be productive. And of course, surprise, surprise, this is a distributist video. I'm going to have to start with some necessary prehistory. I think the real drama surrounding Sargon of Akkad began 9 months ago with his appearance on the now, as far as I can tell, defunct Andy Werski show to debate Richard Spencer on the subject of the alt-right and white nationalism. Now, the interaction was specifically framed as a debate, which struck a lot of people as odd, because debate has quite famously been a weak point of Sargon's. Now, to rewind a bit further, Sargon initially cut his debating teeth in a debate against none other than Christy Winters, an analysis of which was one of the first serious videos I did for this channel, in fact. And of course, this interaction did not go well for Sargon, largely because he accepted the framing that Winters pushed forward from the get-go. Specific jabs and quips inside a debate don't really matter very much if you lose the framing of the entire resolution. But fast forward 1 year, and it seemed Sargon learned his lesson in interactions with people like Thomas Smith at MythCon. In this interaction, Sargon largely came out on top by doing the very thing he neglected to do in his interaction with Winters, namely, he always kept the frame. He always seemed to be the one speaking on topic, whereas Thomas Smith constantly seemed to be equivocating, meandering, trying to bring up peripheral points that didn't really interact with what Sargon was saying. And I think these two experiences really led to the famous interaction between Richard Spencer and Sargon in January of 2018. Sargon arrived not really to address the objections of Richard Spencer, but really to reframe the conversation. Now, to be clear, this frame-first tactic is oftentimes a great way to interact with progressives in a public setting. Progressive arguments are notoriously constructed to procure the approval of an audience, to virtue signal, to equivocate and to obfuscate points in order to seize the moral authority away from whoever they're attacking or whoever they're debating against. In short, there's nothing wrong with fighting fire with fire. However, I think that in the case of the Werski stream, Sargon did not quite understand the context of what he was getting involved in, because his opponents on the alt-right and his audience for the Werski stream were fresh off their own set of dramatic experiences, and these experiences were not leaving them particularly sympathetic or amenable to frame games. Again, to do a rewind, the alt-right had come off the previous summer from one of their most devastating political catastrophes in the movement's existence, that of course being the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. This event marked a fiasco of organizing and of imagistics, and showed the alt-right's total inability to control the message or to safely control their own people. Of course, there were failures of law enforcement and shenanigans from the left, but the failure of that event, including a number of violent incidences, lies mainly with the alt-right leadership. And at the end of the event, there was no escaping that. This resulted in an alt-right that had very little ability to organize, but had an enormous amount of pent-up anger and a feeling of unfairness. Enter one YouTuber called Kraut & T, who himself was already on a crusade against the alt-right in the wake of other drama involving a YouTuber known as Rage After Storm. Kraut took it upon himself a mission that few in the skeptic community had really attempted to date, and that was an intellectual debunking of the alt-right's main arguments against the alt-right's case for racial division and against the alt-right's case for social organization. Thus began one of the biggest fiascos in political YouTube history, as Kraut produced video after video of attempts to debunk the alt-right that resulted in little more than constructed strawmans and a rehash of liberal talking points. As the series went on, it became very clear that Kraut really couldn't answer the counter-criticism to his own series, and a new set of YouTubers cut their teeth at debunking these videos, until Kraut was left only with framing tactics and personal attacks against the people who were criticizing him. Now, I am certainly not going to get into the drama of who is trying to dox who in this whole fiasco. Largely, I think that whole discussion creates more drama than it really resolves. But I will say that it is undeniable that post-fall of 2017, Kraut was engaging more in personal attacks and issue framing than he was with actual intellectual discussion of the ideas at hand. Now, of course, everyone from time to time engages in a little bit of shit-flinging. That's just part of being an internet personality. But once the personal attacks become so persistent, to the point that even now, after 6 months of being offline, Kraut is still largely uploading personal attacks against the people who were his adversaries in the fall of 2017, I think people start taking notice of the fundamental dishonesty that's going on. People were asking themselves, if Kraut and T actually has the goods on the alt-right, why is he stooping to these kind of attacks? Is there any type of intellectual pushback against the alt-right? Now, leaving aside my own pushback against the alt-right, which, relatively speaking, almost nobody watched, I don't think there really had been to this point a lot of good faith criticism against the alt-right's ideas. And people who were supportive of the movement fastened on this in the wake of Charlottesville. Perhaps the movement was poisonous politically, perhaps they would never be allowed in the public square again in any meaningful capacity, but they were damned if they couldn't own anyone in an honest discussion of ideas. Richard Spencer in particular was at this time fastening on just this point, since he, more than any other leader in the alt-right, was responsible for the imagistic and organizational fiasco that was Charlottesville. And he, more than any other leader, was responsible for the state of the alt-right as it existed at the end of 2017. Perhaps by winning out against the skeptic community, the alt-right could show itself to be an unstoppable intellectual force who just hadn't figured out a way of organizing themselves in a productive way politically. And so, with the alt-right sympathetic JF as the moderator of the Worski channel, this was the mood that was present going into the interaction between Richard Spencer and Sargon of Akkad in January of 2018. Now, as I mentioned previously, in my estimation, Sargon's previous experience led him to believe that the path to a successful debate interaction was essentially playing a good frame game, and oftentimes in many public interactions it is. Unfortunately, in this interaction, for this audience, the frame game playbook was just not going to fly. People wanted to know that the skeptics actually had arguments once all of the framing and equivocation and posturing was taken out of it. And that's probably the reason why, even though I think Richard Spencer did quite poorly in his debate against Sargon, most people who watched the Worski stream felt that Sargon came out the lesser of the two parties. Even though I think Styx Hexenhammer, who everyone sort of forgets was on Sargon's side, made some pretty good points, since he was able to stay on topic. But of course, I digress. The Sargon-Spencer interaction marked a bit of a turning point for the YouTube ideas community. I think it marked a permanent blow to the skeptics' image of themselves as the edgiest people on YouTube, and kicked off the rage with internet blood sports, which I think is still partially going on today. More specifically to my point today, it pushed Sargon to realize that the pure skepticism of his own channel would ultimately be insufficient. This resulted in a partial new direction for Sargon's channel, moving towards more serious politics, even developing a new label for him and his followers called liberalists. And of course, as in all attempts to become more serious, Sargon took no small amount of criticism from this, most prominently from one Mr. Metokur, or as the internet likes to call him, Jim. Now, while I didn't comment on it at the time, what went on between Sargon and Jim in this case was one of the most fascinating meta-debates in YouTube history. Ostensibly, the conversation was whether Sargon should try to enter politics more seriously. But the background, the subtext of the conversation, was a debate over what made each channel popular during the first real upswing in views both personalities had during Gamergate. Now, of course, when it comes to the point-and-laugh style YouTube videos that were all the rage between 2014 and 2015, it's very easy to see Sargon and Metokur as the two last man standing from the plethora of channels that arose during the Gamergate hashtag. Now, Jim Metokur has always had a very particular brand from Gamergate to the present day, and this brand has essentially involved combining an extraordinarily apt sense of comic timing, a good radio voice, and an entirely cynical and pessimistic view on human nature and, in fact, the fate of Western civilization. This has led Jim to obtain his image as the jester who plays his lyre and makes jokes as the city burns around him, or as Sargon would put it, the last cool kid on the internet. There's no doubt that Jim Metokur is an incredibly talented entertainer, but I think it's important to keep in mind at all times that his view of the world is entirely cynical. There is no chance for victory, there is no chance for redemption in Metokur's world. There is only endless human failing, endless decline and disintegration, and the people who have kept their wits long enough to laugh at it all fall into the ocean. From Jim's point of view, this laughing at continuous human failure is the only reason why any of us are on YouTube, and this philosophical position certainly made him the ally of the emerging rage over internet blood sports, or IBS as they've been termed. Now, I think the reason for Sargon's success post-Gamergate has always been a little harder to define than Metokur's, and it is very apparent that those who prefer Sargon over Jim do not wish to breathe deep the cynicism that really is required for anyone who takes Metokur's worldview seriously. And so I think after these interactions, the onus really was on Sargon to make good on his promise to take things more seriously. Sargon attempted to do more organization and even attempted to become involved with mainstream United Kingdom politics in the form of UKIP, or the United Kingdom Independence Party. Now, of course, I'd really like to stay out of the weeds of British politics, considering that I do not have a particular expertise in this area. Suffice to say that I think Sargon's problems began in his conflict with another fellow YouTuber and personal friend of mine, Mercian Struggle, who felt that Sargon's brand of internet edgy politics would be ultimately detrimental to UKIP's larger mission to be the voice of conservatism in Britain generally. What followed in short order was a partial defeat of Sargon's political ambitions and a partial vindication of Mercian Struggle's concerns, as past quotes from Sargon were dug up by political opposition. And while most people involved on YouTube would recognize most of these sound bites as little more than internet edgy humor, they nonetheless put a serious damper on Sargon's political ambitions, at least at the party level. This followed up by several statements by Sargon himself that sounded a bit too prideful, especially a few that were directed at none other than Mr. Metokur, led to a type of anti-Sargon pushback led by Jim himself that we're still feeling 1 month out from the original drama. Now, I think what resulted from Sargon's contact with Jim Metokur is more or less the same thing that happens to anyone who gets into an internet spat with Jim Metokur. Metokur sidesteps, reframes the argument, and then delivers a punch to the solar plexus to whoever was thinking he'd get the better of him on the internet. And at this stage, anybody can listen to Mr. Metokur's live streams, his most recent appearance on the Kill stream, the latest iteration of internet blood sports, to get a general sense at how this interaction's been going on. Suffice to say, it's been imagistically embarrassing for Sargon. And sure enough, a lot of the people disappointed with Sargon's lackluster pushback against the alt-right are coming out now to say Sargon's career is over, he's quote-unquote spurging out, and implying that this is a fitting end to somebody whose YouTube career and YouTube dominance has been a little bit too long-lived for the platform. And of course, much of the mockery has focused around Sargon's crackpot ideas, past and future, be they an attempt to portray themselves as friendly to big social media in order to form some kind of an alliance, or the most recent idea of trying to draw Donald Trump into the hashtag Gamergate, long after the movement has more or less died. This, of course, is Sargon at his weakest. And in the wake of these interactions, a lot of people are asking, why did we like Sargon? What is the reason for his popularity? Of course, it's easy to see the reason for Jim Metokur's popularity. He's funny. He takes the piss out of people. You don't need to explain funny. But for this particular moment, people are asking themselves, is Sargon just an artifact of Gamergate? Is he done on YouTube? Personally, I think this is a little silly, and though I have been and will continue to be a major critic of a lot of Sargon's ideas, I think people are missing the forest for the trees on this particular issue. The problem, of course, originates, I think, from Sargon himself not really understanding his own strengths. Sargon was never a person who was extraordinarily good at one thing, but rather a person who was just good at doing a lot of boring things, an all-arounder. He was reasonably well-spoken, both on livestream and in edit. He had a reasonably good sense of humor when it came to taking the piss out of people who were being ridiculous on the internet. He had a reasonably good ability to organize, network, and even conduct interviews. And he still possesses a reasonably good ability to learn from his mistakes on occasion. Sargon's proclivity for throwing out crackpot ideas is something that's been part of his character since the beginning of his channel. It's really not a sign of decline in his fundamentals, it's just what he does. In fact, Sargon exhibits a certain kind of anti-fragility when it comes to having bad ideas. They seem to pass right through him in a way they didn't pass through other channels like Kraut and Tea. What remains constant, as boring as it is just his fundamentals. His ability to keep things going in a relatively stable fashion, at least for YouTube. And I should point out, Sargon has a continuing ability to produce quality content. Just this last week, Sargon released an interview with Steve Bannon, a person who's been lurking in the wings of American politics for quite some time. I remember watching the interview and realizing that as much as I'd heard about Steve Bannon, as much as I'd heard that he was the devil incarnate, I never heard from him from any mainstream media institution. And now I was hearing what I should have been getting from the mainstream on, well, none other than Sargon of Akkad's channel. Now, you might argue that Sargon has an inflated opinion of his own importance, but that's quality content. It's undeniable. I think everyone should take a step back in this entire process and look just at the general state of affairs that we're facing both here on YouTube and also in the political world generally. Of course, I'm not saying Sargon is right on any particular issue. I'm not saying any one of his ideas is good. Probably if someone like Merchant Struggle were to take the specifics of his argument with Sargon and put them in front of me, in all likelihood, I'd probably be on Merchant Struggle's side on that one. But that's not the point. We need to look at the ecosystem of the online ideas community. We need to ask ourselves, what are we doing here? As I said before, I'm under no illusion that what I'm doing is entertainment. But I wouldn't be doing it if it were only entertainment. And I'm sure the people who are watching this, my subscribers, we bias towards more of the serious side. I mean, you don't listen to 40-minute analysis videos because you want a good laugh. Nevertheless, I think that the people who are watching these channels are not simply on board with the maximally cynical and pessimistic Metokur worldview. Are we all here just waiting for the world to burn? I know ostensibly a lot of Sargon's critics outside of Metokur, like Coach Red Pill or Jean-Francois Gariepi, claim to care about larger political goals. But if we do take the goal of something higher than comedy seriously, I think we need to give Sargon another look, and a more charitable assessment of his career going forward. And I think this starts by going back to the original Worski debate between him and Richard Spencer. Now, I partially agree Sargon lost mainly by doing what most generals do, fighting the previous war. He brought the Thomas Smith playbook to a Richard Spencer debate. But has anyone asked where Richard Spencer is right now? Where the rest of the alt-right is? After their victory over Sargon of Akkad? I mean, Spencer isn't Mr. Metokur. He claims to have a higher purpose, to have a higher cause. He claims to want to fight for the future. So what is the alt-right doing now? In short, nothing. They are still, 1 year after the fact, reeling from the blows that were dealt to them in Charlottesville, which I think at this point we can chalk up to being fatal, at least to the movement in its present form. Richard Spencer is a totally toxic property. The only chance he has for any interaction with the mainstream, or being heard by anyone who is not already on his side, is when he's brought on by the left as a punching bag, as somebody who they can repost off of in order to shore up their own fracturing base. Moreover, the state of the YouTube alt-right doesn't fare any better. Both members of the alternative hypothesis have essentially wigged out on the movement and have walked back so many of their previous statements it's hard to know even where they stand right now. Whereas bloggers like Millennial Woes, who I like personally, are subject to the continuous broadsides of a social media censorship campaign currently being run by Facebook, Google, and Twitter. Cut off from any support from the boring normie community, it's hard to know where the movement can go, except of course into more and more purity spiraling. Now, I understand that in many regards, the source of this devastation on the alt-right is due to particular shenanigans by their enemies. Nevertheless, the alt-right's inability to do an anti-fragile pivot is the real problem. While many of their intellectual arguments are still left standing, as far as I can tell, their inability to practice the boring and mundane fundamentals of politics is what I think has led the movement to its current state, and it's hard to see how they'll go forward without additional reform. Now, of course, this is a complete digression away from the subject of this quick take, which was, of course, Sargon of Akkad. But it's hard for me at this moment to not see Sargon of Akkad as a critical element in any attempt to push things forward. His talents are hard to identify because they're so boring. But his sort of internet edginess combined with an otherwise normie-friendly personality, his above-average fundamentals combined with a certain amount of anti-fragility, is something that is, well, necessary. At least if the right side of YouTube wants to break out into the bigger sphere of ideas, into media that can actually influence average people. That's not saying, obviously, that I don't have frustrations and massive disagreements with Sargon. That's not saying that I don't get frustrated with his inability to properly characterize the alt-right, or that I don't consider a lot of his extemporaneous ideas to be, well, crackpot. But I do think it means that he is a critical aspect to an internet ecosystem, and I think that needs to be acknowledged even from people who dislike him personally. If Sargon in particular were to just disappear from YouTube tomorrow, where would that leave right-leaning critics like myself and even people like JF and Millennial Woes? Well, it would leave us further isolated, occupying a segment of YouTube dominated by internet blood sports, which no one in the mainstream will ever take seriously, and it will leave the community more pessimistic, more cynical, more black-pilled than before. And that's not a recipe for political or cultural success. Now, I can already anticipate that I'm going to get a lot of pushback from this video. It's no secret that while I have very, very large ideological disagreements with Sargon, I do find him to be a pretty agreeable man personally. But as far as this partial defense of Sargon of Akkad goes, I want to re-underline that I'm making it in objective terms. And I remember thinking about this when I clicked on his most recent interview involving Steve Bannon. I thought to myself upon finishing, I'm probably going to share this with friends and family. I come from a highly progressive area, and to them Steve Bannon is Lucifer incarnate. I could send them Sargon's interview. They could listen to the interview and perhaps learn something. I imagine most people I forward it to would find Sargon pretty agreeable. And I remember thinking, well, what if Sargon hadn't been the one giving this interview? What if it were Richard Spencer, the supposed winner of the Worski debates? Or perhaps better yet, Jean-Francois Gariepi? Would I even conceivably forward something like that to people I knew in real life? Oh, sure, Aunt B, I know you hate Steve Bannon, but listen to this interview that paints him in a good light, and ignore the fact that below it in the recommended videos, you have the interviewer appearing as a co-host to David Duke. If YouTube is anything more than entertainment, then we have to take seriously the impetus to either explore new ideas in a more or less calm and rational space, or the impetus to reach normies, to connect to people that are very much within the mainstream. And to be quite honest, Sargon of Akkad is reasonably good at that, if nothing else.